that they still think colorism, which is like so hierarchy, hereditary, sort of heredity and endogamy, which is marrying just within your clan, are the three things that are very, very core to our caste system. And at the hierarchy, the top is the Brahmin, which is not true. We never really had a system where the Brahmins wielded power. They never did. And that is why they were respected. Caste, the origins of our discontent. Oprah promoted it. New York Times, it made the New York Times bestseller list as a result. And so caste became a household name. What did Wilkerson do in that book? She equated caste and race together, and she said they cannot be separated. And in that process, she also said that America and India are both oppressive countries similar to Nazi Germany. So, one of her famous quotes from that book is race is the skin and caste is the bones. Well, I sort of disagree with that because in reality, as you have seen, caste was the blood. Caste is the blood purity.
Namaste everyone. Our topic for today's discussion is something which baffles us all, caste in India. And the topic today is caste, a colonial invention and its weaponization in USA. We have had few discussions about this topic before on Sangam Talks, how caste is being used as a weapon in USA and how some mischievous forces with ulterior motives are trying to use this as a weapon. One of the prime goal of such incidents is to create anti-Hindu or Hindu-phobic sentiments or environment in USA or largely around the world. Recently, dismissal of Cisco case against Sundar Iyer is one of the prominent example which clearly shows that how people are being targeted by certain forces. Today, we have Richa Gautamji with us. Welcome Richa ji for this session today. Richa Gautamji is founder of castefiles.com and is associated with castgate.org and castcon.com. She is executive director at caresglobal.org and involved in advocacy for human rights, civil rights and minority rights, especially focused on rehabilitation of persecuted refugees and their education and empowerment. She is working on ethnographic research as Senior Research Associate at Indus University and is a Fellow of the Center of Indic Studies at Ahmedabad. Her research is focused on emic and indigenous ethnographic studies and documenting lived experiences of Indian communities using it for decoding current caste narratives. And she is an expert who has recently written a paper which explains how the caste system is used as a weapon in US, is being used as a weapon in USA. So with that, I request Richa ji to present her presentation to all our audience.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Akshaji. So you're right that caste baffles us all in India, and caste has baffled us even more in the United States because if you think about it, the second generation that is growing up in USA of Indian Americans has never even touched upon that word in a day-to-day life, and today they are being targeted as much as we are by in schools, on campuses, and as Indian Americans we are facing it at workshops, at workplaces, in corporates, etc. So caste as a as a weapon is something that we are seeing in the United States, and it is being used not just to malign our reputation but in a much more toxic form, like the legal case against Sundar Iyer against a temple in New Jersey. This is a trope that has an ability to destroy lives of many and careers of many Indian Americans in the USA if this continues. So yes, we are fighting it every single day in the US, and advocacy for this is going on. What I have done is, to dismantle caste, we have to first understand it. what is going on right now is that caste is being used as a vague term, and it is being used to whether varna, whether jati, whether the SC/ST classification in the constitution, all of that is caste. In US now there is a critical theory, critical caste theory has been sort of invented at Harvard, and that is got its own vocabulary of dominant and suppressed and oppressed classes, and that is being added to this caste sort of conglomerate that is targeting us, right? And of course, the Aryan Dravidian theory or Aryan invasion theory is not far behind. If we have to dismantle caste, Aryan invasion theory or Aryan migration theory or the Aryan Dravidian divide also has to be understood and dismantled, and it has already been. But we have to not see it as two separate things. Caste and Aryan invasion theories were together used to create a weapon against Brahmins
We are
and
yet to
against.
officially discard it.
They
The
are
Aryan
officially
invasion theory.
not discarding it. That's a
Yes,
very
that
good point you raise. They have not discarded it officially, but I think slowly it should fade out because there's so much evidence against it. And I think this is a good time to go to one of the slides that I have here. Okay, this racial theories that were developed during colonial period. So if you look at it, this is very important that we understand the beginning of these terms. Race and caste were two terms that did not exist before the 14th century. In 12th century, what happened was, because there was this whole fight of jihad versus the Christians, the Islamic jihad versus the Christian crusades happened around that time in Spain, where the Christians won, right? The Catholic groups then started to convert the Muslims and the Jews, and that is when the theory of blood libel, etc., began. And if you see the trajectory, those theories are not discussed. They have been banned after post World War II, after the Holocaust happened. But if you look at the Holocaust, it also traces its root to those theories that began. By the time 15th century came, race and caste became crystallized terms. It was known as casta. Casta means chaste, right? It means chaste in the Spanish terminology, and it means purity. And what is that purity? It is blood purity. So that concept of blood purity, where if you're born a Christian, you're purer compared to, say, a Jew who is converted or a Muslim who's converted. They had different names and labels provided, like Muslims were known as the Moriscos in that area. The Jews were known as conversos, and so they were labeled. They were clearly, had to wear tags to show that they are new converts or neo converts, and they were not allowed to hold high position in Spanish society. They could be targeted. There were inquisitions, gory inquisitions during those times in Spain. We all know about the inquisitions that happened during those times. Wherever colonialism happened, in the Americas, in Goa, we have heard of all these inquisitions, in Philippines, right? Wherever the colonial invasions happened by the Portuguese or the Spaniards, there were inquisitions, massive killing, massacres, and all of that is traced to the concept of blood purity and caste and race. So these concepts have nothing to do with indigenous societies. These were invented during the colonial times. And if you look at the theory of the Hamitic hypothesis, when the colonialists went to Africa and they saw a lot of progress and a lot of good things there, they said all of this progress is because of the Caucasus invasions that happened at some point. And so that was the Hamitic hypothesis, very racial, very supremacist, and that has been basically banned now. Nobody talks about it. Most people have not heard about it. If you think about it, Hamitic hypothesis is a very old sort of terminology, because Africa has been sort of, the conquest in Africa was complete. Hamitic hypothesis actually is very similar to Aryan invasion. When they saw Africa had lot of, like Ghana had its own, a kingdom, the Ashanti kingdom, and they had so many civilizational achievements all over Africa. So the colonialists would not accept that this could be done by people who are dark in color. So they invented a theory which said that there were people who came, the Hams, they came from Caucasia, and they invaded Africa, and they brought civilizations to Africa. Now that theory is dead, right? Because the conquest in Africa is complete. In India, they developed the Aryan invasion theory, right? And that theory also said similar things. I think that is, everybody's familiar with that. And that also said that, oh, the indigenous people are the Dravidians, or the Adivasis, so called, and the Aryans invaded, and then they brought the horse, they brought Vedas, they brought all, and who are they? They are the Brahmins. That is how the whole, because Brahmins were revered for their knowledge in India. So they said, okay, these are the people who are considered superior in this country, but they were considered superior for very different reasons, not because of the color of their skin, not because of anything else, but because they were scholars. They had their own, sacrifice, tap and tyag, sacrificing their wealth, right, and not focused on material.
Blood purity or something.
Nothing like that, right? There was no blood purity.
They were there for their knowledge.
They were revered for their knowledge and their sacrifice of material wealth. So that was our culture, but the Aryan Dravidian theory, unlike the Hamitic hypothesis, has not gone away. Other theories also have gone away, like the phrenology, where the size of the cranium, the whites had a bigger cranium, so they will have a bigger brain, and so they are superior. So for example, J.C. Bose, he was such a phenomenally brilliant scientist that even the British establishment had to give him a position, but he received less salary, 1/3 of the salary of the whites, because they said, not just your color of your skin, but the size of your brain is going to be smaller than ours, right? So they had established that rule that they will get lesser salary. So that concept is now dead. It has been banned. The scientific racism, which said if your nose, nasal, based on this, nasal index, they would say, okay, you are superior or inferior. So it was so focused on spirit, not spiritual, but on material, on physical characteristics of people, on the color, the nose, the size of the head, their height. All these kind of things were more important to these colonialists than the fact that people had achieved some, higher status or higher scholarship or higher spirituality. That was not at all on their radar. So that is why these theories were very detrimental to humanity. They created major problems, including the Holocaust, are part of these colonial theories that are, laid out on this trajectory or this graph. And in the 19th century, as you can see, Criminal Tribes Act was another important one. I'm sure you've heard of that, That was also in India. Criminal Tribes Act was an act against people who rebelled against British, or also some people like the sadhus and those nomads in India, or Banjaras, those who sang music and were moved from one place to the other. They were considered a threat to society and they were banned. Also, police of the native culture who were part of the kingdom, in South they were called the Kallars. Those who practiced things like Kallaripayattu, they were all banned, and they were at birth labeled as criminal. They had to report to the police stations. So these are some of the theories that we should know about and how they have been discontinued, because even the colonialists, even the whites, after World War II, they realized what a bad effect it can have. Something like the Nazi Germany, government that came up with Hitler, and the Holocaust and killing of millions and millions of Jews there. That is the kind of havoc it could lead. So eventually, human rights and UN was established, all of that. But still, why are caste and Aryan Dravidian theories not removed, from our textbooks and from our sort of day-to-day existence? That is because India remains the only civilization that has not been completely relegated to the museums. There is still work to be done, but we have to dismantle it, and we have to bring back our decolonized existence. So I think this was an important sort of a touch base. And so this was actually this is the way we are just going to proceed in our presentation, where I want to talk about how caste and race were such supremacist ideas, which we just discussed. But then caste as a concept needs to be analyzed for its origins, for its relation to blood purity, and how it is hierarchical. So, we are always told in India that your system is hierarchical, it is endogamous, and it is hereditary. So, I want to go through these points and explain what is the reason that what we have in India as a social organization is not caste. Marriage is an important part of caste because whenever the colonialists, the white colonialists, interacted with the indigenous population, the biracial births caused due to their marriages or even rapes, those biracials were called as, they had different labels, but that is how the caste system was born.
They were never given the legit position in their family.
In society.
Yes.
Yeah. So they were ranked on hierarchy. So this is something very interesting that we will sort of look into, besides looking at the politics of caste census, because everybody is talking about the caste census now. So we are going to just talk briefly about the politics are behind it. And then also the very important point, which I feel is something we miss out, the caste trope and Hindutva. What is the correlation between the two?
Was this to some extent practiced in Islamic countries as well, the blood purity concept?
Definitely.
Because I was watching Vikram Sampatji's video recently, something I was watching, and he mentioned that even at its height, Mughal Empire never had more than 66%, sorry, not 66, 6% only, more than 6% of converted Indian Muslims in his kingdom what would we call it, in the management. Not more than 6% Indian Muslims. Like he was bringing people from Iran, from Persia, and making them the ministers and everything. Indian Muslims were not given any position in the Mughal rule. So were they following it as well to some extent?
Very much, very much. So definitely it was the similar colonial system followed by them. And I think what you mentioned is very, very true, that they used to import migrants from Middle East to rule, and they would marry Rajput. Say for example, Amir Khusro, he was born of a Turkish father and a Rajput mother. So that was very common. They would come and they would, marry Rajput women or Indian women. And so they were considered, again, there was a hierarchy there, right? So those who came first, they were the first blood, the pure bloods. Then those who came and were born with a mixed race. Then, of course, the ones who were converted from Hindu into Muslims. And then you had, of course, the Hindus who had to pay the jizya, and they were discriminated against. They could not mount a horse. And these were very similar systems. In fact, if I may say, the Christians actually learned this from the Islamic Jihad that happened in Spain. You have to remember that they learned it first. They did not invent this system, but then they felt that this power system, either it'll be the Christians or it'll be the Muslims who will win, right? So that fight has not stopped really. The only thing is there's one more element, the communists who have joined the gang. So that is how this whole system is. And if you look at the Pakistani hierarchy, it is similar. It is still there. You know, the migrants from here to Pakistan are called the muhajirs, and if you see the sort of the you know the
Idols, these idols are still from Afghanistan, from Iran, from Turkey. They
yes.
do not have any native idols.
Yes, so they have a very clear hierarchy in Pakistan also even now. So that system has not gone even in many of these parts of the world. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So one of the other things I wanted to point out was how caste was related not just to color, we just went through that. So that biracial births caused the invention of caste. So how chaste are you? How pure are you? How pure is your blood? That is caste, according to what the word means, right? And so to call our system as caste is in India is itself such a big label of sort of misnomer. It's a misnomer, and it creates confusion among people in the West because they know that caste is about blood purity. It is about ranking people hierarchically. It is about hereditary nobility, which are things that we did not have.
So they still think it like that in those terms, like Western people, let's just say European or American people, do when they hear caste, they still think it in the sense of blood purity hierarchy, or
They absolutely think it in terms of hierarchy, which they think is blood purity, because that is why they say Brahmins at the top and untouchables at the bottom, and those kind of concepts have been sort of widely discussed in the US. Color, they always say these days that Brahmins were white and Shudras were black or Dalits were black. So this is not true. As you would know, we have a wide range of color across the country. And my grandma, who of course has seen the British time, she used to tell this joke. She said when the British came to our country, they used to say कि हम लोग तो सब गोरे गोरे हैं, आप लोग सब अलग अलग कलर के कैसे हैं? So they said the Indians would say that सब हमारे यहाँ तो सारे घोड़े होते हैं, वो सब मल्टी कलर होते हैं, सिर्फ गधे होते हैं, वो सिर्फ गोरे होते हैं. So only the asses are white. The horses always have a different colors. So this is and there were lots of such jokes. Obviously, our people are very good at making jokes if people are being to fight oppression and suppression, making good music. So we definitely have a list of such jokes which we should collect actually. But that said, colorism, you're right that they still think colorism, which is like so hierarchy, hereditary, sort of heredity, and endogamy, which is marrying just within your clan, are the three things that are very, very core to our caste system. And at the hierarchy, the top is the Brahmin, which is not true. We never really had a system where the Brahmins wielded power. They never did. And that is why they were respected. Now, that said, I wanted to talk about what really is caste. What really is caste hierarchy? They make this pyramid of Brahmins on the top, etc. But in Americas, this was a legal reality. We never had that legal reality in day-to-day life. But they had the noble or the Spaniards who were born in Spain were considered as peninsulares, or the nobles, and they were kept at the top. And they had all the rights, they were all the privileges. Then the Criollos, Spaniards who were born in Americas. Then the mestizos, who were individuals of mixed European and indigenous Native American ancestry. So they were white and brown mix, right? Castizos, again, who had 3/4 Spanish and 1/4 Amerindian. Think about the complicated way they have just named people based on the color purity, and the color of their skin and how much blood of Spain they have. 3/4, 1/8, these are the kinds of ways they measured it. Mulattoes were, then comes the black plus white, right? So even the blacks were there brought as slaves in Americas. And so mulattoes, Zambos, And then, of course, at the very bottom came the indigenous Native Americans, and the last was the Negroes. And that is why the N word is banned in US now, because, you know, they realize that this is such a racist system that the words itself are no longer used, right? Because they are racist. And I want to talk here about Wilkerson, the recent book called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. Oprah promoted it. New York Times, it made the New York Times bestseller list as a result. And so caste became a household name. What did Wilkerson do in that book? She equated caste and race together, and she said they cannot be separated. And in that process, she also said that America and India are both oppressive countries similar to Nazi Germany. So, one of her famous quotes from that book is, "Race is the skin and caste is the bones." Well, I sort of disagree with that, because in reality, as you have seen, caste was the blood. Caste is the blood purity. That is what caste is. I mean, it's a simple definition which we should note and know, that caste is just about blood purity. It is not the bones, it did not, the system of the casta may be the bones of this country, but race is the skin and caste is the blood purity. So, how did caste emerge in colonial states? It emerged due to marriage. Not even marriage, it may be rapes also, but it was because of mixed blood. So, this point, I keep saying blood because we have forgotten that that is what caste really means when they talk about purity, when they talk about untouchability. That was practiced during colonial times, whether in Muslim societies or in Christian societies.
This is how they described it.
This is how they described it. But then they imposed that idea into India, saying that, oh, this is what you are practicing, right? So this is something we have to redefine ourselves. So caste, there was a visitor, Don Pedro, who went to Mexico in the 18th century, and he said, one of his quotes is very interesting to me, because he says, if the mixed blood or the biracial birth is the offspring of a Spaniard and an Indian, the stigma of race slowly disappears at the third step in descent, which means after marrying at the third generation level, because it is held as systematic that a Spaniard and an Indian produces a mestizo. A mestizo and a Spaniard will produce a castizo, and a castizo and a Spaniard will produce a Spaniard, right? Because this person has 7/8 blood of Spanish ancestry. That is how blood purity played its part. So what happened there? What happened there was people always wanted to marry a whiter person. That promoted the idea that white is superior. That promoted the concept of what is called hypergamy. So anyone who has legal stature and social stature higher than them was more desirable as a spouse.
More privilege.
More privilege. And then later you can become, at the third step you'll be like, wow, now my family is a Spaniard. These people are Spaniards. So by the third generation. So this is the way the society was structured. This is very important to know, because hypergamy as a concept means that there is privilege at a higher level. Whereas endogamy, which we are criticized for all the time, what does endogamy then mean? Endogamy then means that people like to stay within their jati and community because they want to preserve their culture. They don't think that climbing higher is going to give them any sort of privilege in legal parlance or in social structure. So they prefer to keep their society sort of close-knit, right? So endogamy in itself shows that our society was not hierarchical. So that is what I want to break the myth, that Indian society was not hierarchical, because in one way there was no concept of hypergamy. Really, there was no desire to marry outside. Endogamy was preferred. When Risley came and invented the scientific racism process and tried to implement it in India during the caste census, He tried to establish a hierarchical model using the nasal index, and he said, oh, the metal workers and the metallurgy craftsmen in India consider themselves superior to those who make, say, baskets or some other non-metal products. So that is why those people who are, say, indigenous natives, those who make baskets or pots, they want to marry the metal workers, and that's why. But then that theory never bought, so he was trying to establish hypergamy models, because when the colonialists came to India, they could not establish the model of hypergamy. They were not able to establish the model of hierarchy, because the whole idea of creating that ethnographic state or creating caste census or building this caste system in India of dividing people was to rule, was to divide, was to also establish these sort of systems in India. But whenever the true anthropologists, there were some good people there too, social scientists like Ibbetson and Senart, and they found that there was no hierarchy. They said not only is there no hierarchy, the society is fluid and mutative. It changes. Suddenly there may be Jats who have more power in the North India, but then in some parts it may be like the metal workers, or it may be the other castes who will get more power. So it was very, very mutative, very, very fluid, and varied by region. So they were never able to pinpoint as to what is the real hierarchy in India, and that is why Risley's attempts to create the hierarchical model completely failed in India.
I feel their hierarchy was on blood purity, our was on mental capacity. I feel so.
Yes, actually, we can go a little bit into that, because I do have a small chart about what was our
What was
social
yours?
organization. Yes. Think about it then. What was the caste system? The caste system is a system of privileges where it depended on race, your color of your skin, it depended on blood, the purity of your blood, whether you were white versus, we just discussed that. So the system of the caste, it depended on a religious purity. If you converted to Christianism, you were born a Christian, you were higher. If you converted, you were higher than the one who was not. And those kind of classifications also existed. Okay, and in Philippines it was practiced very, very, there were many more classifications there, about 15 or 16 classifications. I have that in my research paper. But all of these people were then on their ranking given legal privileges. So, for example, the lowest person cannot mount a horse ever. Maybe the second lowest or third lowest can mount a horse, but as soon as he sees the white noble, he has to climb down and salute him. So those are the kinds of things that caste system encouraged. That is why it encouraged hypergamy, it encouraged conversions, and had legal codes of oppression and inquisitions. That's why it became very, very popular and draconian, right? So if anyone at the higher level says, oh, this person was actually pretending to be a Christian convert, but he's not really, he's practicing in his house, he's still a Jew. So then the Inquisition begins, the blood libel, and then they're tortured like crazy. The torture chambers of the Inquisition, open air torturing was very common, which ended by hanging them. So caste and blood purity, as you know, also led to Holocaust, where there was again the same concept, to understand blood purity, German blood versus Aryan blood versus etc. etc. Obviously, caste and blood purity also helped to decimate the colored population in Americas. Why? Because people were constantly trying to become whiter to get better legal rights, right? They wanted by the third generation to become as white as possible. So if you go down to the Americas, South America, you will never find too many, brown people. They're so white over there, many of them, that you will not be able to tell that they were born not, originally Spaniards. So this is how it plays out, the caste system. Have we seen anything similar to that in India? Not at all. We've never had legal privileges by our varna or by jati. Never. We've never had religious discrimination, which is why all religions survive very well in India. Whether it's the Jews, we've always had those, very Vasudev Kutumbakam, and those kind of concepts of equality. And blood purity was absolutely never ever discussed in India, and that sort of hierarchy never existed. Racial purity also, colorism did not exist. I think that joke that I said from my dadima summed that up. We were all of different colors. But then, what was the real colonial observation of what the Indic social structure was at that time? And the Jati organization was, I think it was a consensus among the colonialists that there are various ways the Indian society is sort of organized: Varna, Jati, Kula, caste, Kula, and all those ways. But then Jati seems to be the predominant way in which it is organized. And endogamous marriages was important. Keeping traditional occupations was important, right? Because hereditary occupational system did exist at that time. Common settlements was important. Commensality was important, right? Commensality was the one that now is called untouchability, but this was common that people would eat within their societies. They had their own ways of eating, own ways of cooking, so they would not partake from each other's food, or water. So that sort of sanctity, or could be hygiene maintenance, so our purity is based on what is called as shocha, as hygiene, so our principles were principles of shocha. So like, if you're not taken a bath, we cannot enter the kitchen or the puja ghar. That is the kind of purity we practice of achara and vichara, and of shocha, of cleanliness. So that is a whole different thing. To call that as a purity or a hierarchy, supremacist, is not true, and that is something we have to really, really demarcate clearly. And then, of course, they had common rituals, common worship, like Vishwakarma would be for the carpenters or people who worked on craftsmen, etc. So that was what Jati organization looked like, right, at that time. So that is why caste is a misnomer for Indian social organization. We should never be told to use the word caste, and this should be banned from, it's just like it's the N word for us. Just like the blacks were just called Negroes because of the color of their skin, they had no other identity. Caste has become that trope for Indian Americans also, and India, as you said. So this is very, very important that we start to dismantle it completely by understanding what it really means.
So has this become a slur or something in America for Indians? Like,
it has always been a slur.
So what do they call? Casteist is like a
Yes.
term that they gave to all Indians.
Absolutely.
Is it like that?
Yes. So one of the things that you will read in media is that wherever the Indians go, they bring caste, and so obviously it means something bad. And if you're having a debate with someone, this has famously happened to Pandit Satish Sharma. It has famously happened to me, to a friend of mine I met yesterday, that if they are losing a debate on something we are talking, they're like, but you guys have your caste system. I'm sure you're casteist. And that's it. They derail the conversation by just calling us caste. So it's a slur. It's totally a slur. It's a label that they have put on us as, okay, you're a casteist, so you're bad. You have a caste system, you're bad. The truth is, we don't have a caste system, because they do understand what caste really is, which is why, they know how much harm it has caused during the Inquisitions. They know how much harm it has caused in society, in the colonial societies. So that is what they think India was, which is not true. So we need to dispel that with regular narrative building, because narrative is what it is all about. There is a politics to the census that is being asked today in India also. They're saying we want a caste census.
And there was a politics and it was done earlier as well.
It was. In the British caste census, it was completely
driven by politics.
Driven by politics. It was driven by the idea to understand the Indian society, create an ethnographic state, which actually is useful to the British, and they can divide and rule.
Find and exploit those fault lines.
About
Because
client
they were very
situations.
surprised. I hear it from one of our speakers that they were very surprised by 1857's revolt. That how come these
Yes.
scattered people came together to revolt against us.
Yes.
So they wanted to find out those fault lines and exploit them later on.
You are so right. And that's why the caste census began in like around 1871 and 1891, I think it became much more. So this is why also Dirks calls it the caste of mind. It's the caste of mind because as the colonialists, the anthropologists, the social scientists who came to India, they realized that caste is not, it's a sort of a non-hierarchical society, and it is a society that is mutative, it is fluid. So they were not really able to pinpoint. It's a place where there was a lot of equality, a lot of so these are not my observations. These are readings that I have made of what colonialists said. And they saw a level of close knit groups, the Jatis, having a lot of unity and, sort of just interconnected with others, but within themselves they would be just very thick. So he called it the model of disunity that keeps the unity alive in India. He called it that, and I think that was very beautiful, his observation. He said, the Indian social system is a system of social disunity, where the jatis are closely knit with each other, and um, outside of that, they practice a lot of separation, but that is what keeps them together. It is hard to convert, he said, because they just help each other out. Nobody wants to move out of their jati system. So that is why breaking the jati system was so important to them, and they tried to break the back of the work that people did, the shipping industry, the textile industry. They tried to break as much as possible the unity within the core groups, the jati groups, but never really worked out. So that's why the convergence, it did happen, but not enough for them. So that's why the project is still on, I think. That is what's going on. But to show that caste is not a sterile exercise, and to end that point, the caste of mind, that is why Nicholas Dirks calls it the caste of mind, I think, because he says that it was a concept that has now been added to our identity politics, right? It is part of that framework. It is not a reality on the ground, really, in many ways. There are, like I said, those social disunities, but they are still not discriminatory, as in the way that blood purity was, for example. So he calls it the castes of mind because they still stay within our mental framework because of the daily discussions, because it's in the constitution, and so it's really impacting who we are. It's our identity that is being played with. So census, as I said, even in USA when they had the census, it had the tracings of the castas system, the system of the castas. The blacks and the Native Americans were they were classified by their blood purity. So there was this one drop rule, which is very famous, that the black population was classified by how much black blood is within them. Quadroons means quarter, right? A 1/4 of it is black blood, rest is, say, white or Native American or that. Octoroons is 1/8 of the blood is black, rest is maybe white. So this one drop rule actually meant that even if there's a single drop of blood which is from the black gene, then they'll be called black. That's it.
Okay.
That is the level of discrimination you're looking at, the level of blood purity concept.
Then why were they trying to identify if it's 1/5, 1/6, 1/3? What does?
So that's the obsession with blood purity. That is what we cannot understand, that unless we go into their minds, right? Why are they doing this? Even at the end of around 1935 or so, the Americans said, like, why are we doing this? They stopped doing it because there was a lot of protest also. People said, we will not report our blood like that. So then they said, why are we doing this? Let's stop it.
And
So,
I am assuming this mixing would have started after the Civil War of America. Because before that, I think it was kind of impossible or
Well, it was not impossible because rapes of slaves was very
slaves.
common.
Yes, yes,
The slaves were raped very, very often, okay, even though they felt like there was segregation, but they had no problem raping the slaves. So, and as you know, famously, even, some of the big leaders, like I know Jefferson had uh, a relation with a black woman, and uh, Jackson, all of these big leaders uh, of America also had, children with black women. So
understood.
that was very, very common, very, very common. So the vice versa may not have been common at
Right.
all. They would just not allow that, right?
There would not be any African marrying a
White woman.
white woman,
Yes.
but the other way around was prevalent by force mostly. We
Yes.
can say.
Yes, you can say that. And again, one important thing that I found out when I was looking at the American census was that Hindu was considered a nationality for a long time. It was not, Hindu was not a religion for them. Anybody, who came, and so when we say that when we say this today, that Hindu is a nationality, there is so much protest, right? That, oh no, you cannot call a Muslim a Hindu or a Sikh a Hindu. But that was how they classified people. Anybody coming in the census, anybody coming from India was classified as a Hindu.
So when was this then? Again, can you?
This was before 1930.
Before 1930.
Before 1930, when the census were held in America, that is how they were classified. So that is why the census is not a sterile exercise. When you go to the British census, like I said, Risley, a lot of the anthropologists and the people managing the census before Risley came in 1901, they were not creating this sort of hierarchy or the Varna Jati conflation. They were just sort of measuring the Jatis and, the people of India. But Risley tried to do that through his very clear nasal index theory, where he used color of the skin, nasal index, and the size of the cranium to define where all the jatis will fall, how high or low. And there was so much protest that in 20, 30 years, that process also was ended. They had to stop that completely. So that said, one important thing to note is that C.J. Fuller, he's an anthropologist, and he said that there was absolutely no recognition of a middle class in British Indian census. And if you think about it, this is an important point that I want to make, that if you look at economic theory, it is very important that all rich countries, like India was at that time, India was either the first or the second richest country in the world at that time. 33% of the world GDP until the Mughals came, and after that, around 25, a quarter of the world's GDP is a lot of money in India.
And then 30% was being done by China, so 50% from this region.
Absolutely. And the population also fell sort of like that time. But that is the point, very important to us, that every rich society has a very big middle class if it is doing well. So there was no recognition by the British of the middle class because they were slowly trying to break India. And we will look at a graph. They were trying to break India's entrepreneurship, its industry, and they did that very successfully. And they also did a very important thing that destroyed India's economy, which is wealth extraction. So we'll go through some of that looking at Angus Madison's charts. But if you look at caste census that is being asked today in India by all of the opposition parties, I think Rahul Gandhi is the most vocal right now. Why are they asking for the caste census? So there are two aspects to it. Why is Hindu nationalism being used so much, Hindutva? And so there was a very, very controversial conference in USA called the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference. I think everybody mostly heard about it. There were a million emails that went out to universities that were participating in this conference. About 60 to 80 universities participated in that conference, and their South Asian departments were discussing for about 9 seminars in there for about 3 days, discussing various aspects of what I'm guessing the title was Dismantling Global Hindutva. So that is why I did a study to using artificial intelligence to see what are they discussing, what is their concept of Hindutva, and what are they looking for when they want to dismantle Hindutva. And what I found was that it was a classic case study of breaking India, the book by Rajiv Malhotra ji. And so I'm working on documenting this and creating a little monograph which will be published soon. But I want to bring these points because caste census is becoming such a big discussion point, and they're going to continue talking about it, I've heard, even after the elections. So, why is this coming up? Because as we discussed for the Americas, caste or census or any census, when in British India, whether in Americas or now when caste census has been stopped since the, I think, inception of India, independent India. And why now after 75 years? So that was discussed during this conference of Dismantling Global Hindutva. So my question is the caste census a way to dismantle global Hindutva? Because that was a very prominent part of the discussion in the conference. What they also wanted to do was separate out Adivasi code as a separate religions, animism as a separate religion, so that they can understand how the, who are the Adivasis or the people who, Adivasi is a controversial word, a colonial word in itself. But that is what is being discussed also during these conferences.
Was anybody invited from India? Anybody we know?
Yes. Actually, yeah, a lot of the forces which you would say are breaking India, forces are people who are sort of who have created controversial movies. Like Anand Patwardhan was part of the conference. I think there was a lady called Nandini Sundaram from JNU, or she's yeah. So a lot of these people who have been working on sort of dividing India, Naxal forces, they were there. I mean, not Arundhati Roy, but people similar to her, who advocate for sort of forces that would divide India. So those kind of forces were present at this
people
conference.
with communist mindset, I guess.
I guess that would be the short way to put it. Yes. So that is very important to know, because these terms that they use are very important to them. That why is RSS using the word Vanavasi for when they go to the Adivasi areas? Why do they not use the word Adivasi? So when we start to talk about ourselves in our own terminology, that seems to them as Hindutva. So they feel that is what narrative building is all about, isn't it? That you have been defined by the colonialists, and now when you start to say no, we don't think Adivasi is the right term, then if Northeast starts to merge with India and Indic identity, then it is for them Hindutva, right? And when the Adivasis were being coached to worship Mahishasur and consider Durga as the white lady who is killing a Dalit, Mahishasur, so that is the kind of stories that they are building among the Adivasis, who are simple people, right? People who forest dwellers, and they sometimes buy these stories. But then now when the RSS gives them some memories of who they really are by, because they have been worshipping in the Indian tradition for the longest time. It is interesting to note that a lot of these people who live in the forest were earlier hunted down during the Criminal Tribes Act, due to the Criminal Tribes Act during the British times. So again, those are things that we have not yet completely deciphered, completely catalogued, and we need to start doing that. That who are the criminal tribes, how did they survive, and where are they now, from the British times. So that said, the caste census...
What was that quote? Sorry to... Hindustan. Last line.
Hindi, so this was actually made by one of the panelists there, and she said that the Adivasis, we are trying to teach them that the Hindi Hindu Hindustan slogan, which is I think being given by the Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram, is a bad slogan, and you should say English and indigenous India. I mean, English, which is like a colonialist language, and then you're saying indigenous India. So, I mean, the bizarreness of these statements is just, it's
So
just
it is being
mind-boggling.
used English indigenous India, or is
Well,
it a
I
suggestion that
don't
they
think
should use this instead of
that's a
Hindi?
suggestion, but I don't think it caught on, obviously, given the kind of
Okay.
irony, that oxymoron that exists right there. So I don't think it really caught on like the Hindi Hindu Hindustan slogan. Of course, they want to stop the Northeast from embracing its Hindu roots, which are very clearly there. So there was discussion around, are there ways in which the Northeasterners are creatively resisting these Hindutva assimilative forces and discourses. So there has been a lot of discussion during this conference about the politics of India, how the power structure is changing, how Congress versus BJP needs to sort of define its political strategies. And it was obviously a lot of discussion was pro-Congress. It was a political conference, if I may say so, and anti-BJP discussion was very rampant. And even though they said that this is about Hindutva, not about Hinduism, there was a lot of targeting of Hinduism, and Brahmin hate was the highest.
And who was the core organizer?
So I think Audrey Truschke and her gang was part of this conference, organizing it. So the Brahmin trope, which I think Breaking India also mentions, the cunning Brahmin as at the root of all evil, right? That concept, an attack on Hindutva, was also an attack on Brahmins and Hinduism. So that has to be seen with a lot of seriousness, that this is coming to USA. It's not happening in India. So we know that the forces outside of India are also discussing and working against India. And these are academic institutions, Ivy Leagues, where our children go to study.
That's the most surprising part.
That is the most surprising. In the name of independent thought, freedom of academia, they were able to go and make this happen, have the conference despite all the opposition, and talk absolute sort of antagonistic stuff about Hindus and Brahmins. So this Brahmin hate obviously is a continuation from the colonial times, because the colonialists noticed that the Brahmins are revered. Whatever their position in society, they may be the peon, they may be the rickshaw puller, but they were at that time respected. People would go touch their feet. And once they saw that, they decided to create this trope as Brahmins are the evil.
Even before that, I think even in Muslim era, in Muslim invasion era, Brahmins were painted as evils or by Mughal rulers and all. I have heard few cases of that scenario.
I think they were very good at killing them right there, as far as I know.
They were killing them, that is very true. But still, they were resisting, and they wanted, well, because Brahmins were not converting, others were not also converting.
Yes.
So that is why they started painting them in a bad light, that they are exploiting you, they are making you do this. I have heard from Kapil Kapoor sir,
Right.
that he says that even in Islamic invasion era, Brahmins were being painted as evil people, and all those
Yes.
things were happening even then.
Actually, you're right.
Maybe they picked it up from them, that only, the Britishers.
Well, the British were always good with their own research. They were very, very methodical. The Muslims always used force. The British used the power of narrative. And they created
Propaganda.
a very beautiful divide and rule program, like the Periarism, that their own people will be turned against the Brahmins. That is what they were good at. And they can sit and watch the show. The Islamic invaders were barbaric, and they would just openly just kill them, and they would count the Janeu and the weight of the Janeus and say, look, this is our conquest for today. So the Islamists, I have studied how they function. So if you know the the gurus of the Sikh gurus, obviously, so they were the ones who fought, right? The Sikhs fought the Islamic invasions a lot. Of course, our Rajputs also fought, but a lot in Kashmir and Punjab, and the Sikh gurus helped save when the temples were destroyed, and when they were trying to convert. I think a lot of the Sikh gurus were instrumental in helping people to save their religion. But important thing I want to mention is that they also got killed, not just the Brahmins, tortured and very badly tortured. So they were a big, just कहते हैं ढाल, they were the big sort of wall of resistance for us. The Christians had the Knights Templar. Similar to this, they had a special group of people who would just say that we'll die for their religion, that is. And for Indians, it was, and Hindus, it was the Sikhs. So again, the British were very good at not destroying the Sikhs, but bringing them to their side. During the 1850s and after. So they worked very differently, I would say, very differently. Cunningly, very cunning. So I want to just say there were various labels that were, put on us. Now, from these terms, which are being used all the time to discuss caste. Caste is obviously a foreign word, we keep saying. But then we make the mistake of not realizing that these very Indian sounding words are also all foreign words. They are born during the British times, right? And people like Salvatore Barbinus, who just created a paper on caste, he said Dalit is a religious word. People in India still use the word Adivasi to describe people in, what does that mean, in the forest. Adivasi just means that they are indigenous people and everyone else is an invader based on the Aryan invasion. So Adivasi is again feeding into the Aryan theory, feeding into the Dravidian theory, feeding, these words have to be dismantled. Scheduled castes and scheduled tribes were depressed classes. How were they created? They were created through 6 ways in the British times. Because India was the richest country, we did not have depressed classes of that level in India. Brahmins did not have the wealth. The Kshatriyas did not tax except about 13 to 15%. The Vaishyas and the Shudras were the ones, and the Jati guilds, they had the money. They had the power of trade and wealth and, so these are the people and the warriors who were destroyed through de-weaponization, and hunting them down, declaring them criminal tribes, whether the police, the tax system of the older kingdoms, even the sort of messengers and, the angadiyas, what are called in India, like those who carried money, or so that would take away the wealth or the tax of the British. So they declared all of them criminal tribes, So that is how criminal tribes were created. They became hunted, they lost their place in society. People would not interact with them because they would be labeled also as suspicious. So they became sort of the untouchables, the people who were, excluded out of society because it was wrong to interact with them. So we don't realize, but these are the ways in which, our people were sort of social engineering happened, and how scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, the depressed classes were created, right? How untouchability also manifested on a large scale because these people lost their achara, their shocha, their daily rituals and routines. So they were considered unclean, not because unclean of blood. Again, we need to remember that it was unclean in their hygiene, in the way of life, which is very important to a Hindu. That's where the shampoo word comes from India, because we taught them literally some of the concepts of hygiene. So de-weaponization, criminal tribes creation, the extraction economy of 80% of or higher, of taxation, killing our textile industry, our wealth, all of that, our shipping industry, everything was destroyed by the British, right? And also they created man-made famines through various ways. I've done a research on that also, and that is probably another paper. It's a very, very important paper which I think Sangam has not presented so far, but it is something we need to talk about. But these are some of the ways in which these Dalit, Adivasi, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes were created. And this is the Angus Madison graph that I was talking about earlier. How the wealth of India, which was at the highest level from 1 AD until later, how it plummeted after 1870. It started to just fall down, right? 1870, 1871, when the British Crown took over India, and this whole process of depleting India of its wealth started. And then Britain immediately started to sort of gain ground, right? So this whole process of Britain becoming richer, India becoming poorer, was captured by Angus Madison. And the Indian middle class was destroyed by Britain. That is how India became from a 33% to quarter of the world's economy to less than 2%,
2%, yeah.
of economy by the time the British were leaving. So that is the story of the scheduled caste.
With less than 3-4% literate as well, I guess.
17% literacy rate,
17.
right? Which is like pathetic, right? When earlier, when the British came, the literacy rate was about 80 to 90% even. So that depletion also happened because the Islamic invasions destroyed gurukuls, destroyed our, women's rights to education. So if you think about it, we faced 1,000 years of onslaught, and we are still here to tell our story because of the years and years of fight and resistance that our people gave to this invasion, whether colonial or the Islamic barbarism. So I want to end the DGHC discussion, I just want to talk about what was the very important finding that we got, and then we go to the last slide, which is, I think, very interesting, and I would love feedback on that from people. Caste trope and Hindutva. Why is the caste census being talked about? Why is Stalin also talking about ending Hinduism? Why is there so much, hate being thrown globally against Hindus? Why is the caste trope being activated in all global, in USA, in UK, globally? Why is it being activated? And I wanted to understand how is caste related to Hindutva, and actually it was a byproduct of doing this AI-based sentiment analysis that I conducted of the transcripts of the DGHC conference. And what I found was that there were various ways in which Hindutva was defined by the opponents of Hindutva. The first thing is, of course, when a government is, not that it's pro-Hindu or anything, but it's not anti-Hindu. It is not doing anti-Hindu things. It is treating Hindus equally as the BJP may be doing today. It is called as a Hindutva or Hindu nationalism. Secondly, when the caste calculus breaks during the voting patterns and the divide and rule policy does not work, then it is called as Hindutva. There was a lot of discussion during this conference about Dalits voting for BJP. What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to get back our people from, from voting for BJP? That was a political conference, and that was discussed there openly. When tribal identities, northeastern identities, and other identities in India start to find their Indic roots and assimilate with Indian civilization, then that is also called Hindutva. When there is no resistance against them, conversions become harder, right? That is also Hindutva. So there was a lot of discussion around, can we connect these Adivasis to indigenous peoples movement across the world? so that they can become a stronger force against these Hindu forces, and stop assimilating into India. So if you can read Breaking India right there, it is visible very clearly. And very important, when we assert our Indic identity in any form, take pride in our tilak and bindi, or in our dress and in our culture, that is also Hindutva for them. When we start to define our own identities, for example, we say caste is not a Hindu word, when we say Aryan Dravidian theory is not correct, when we say Adivasi is not the right word, Vanavasi is a better word for describing our people, because forest dwelling has happened from Ramayan times, even maybe before that. But then when we say that and we define our identities, that according to them is Hindutva, when we give up colonized vocabulary. So these are like very, very important things that we need to keep doing in order to, and that is when I realized that, I grew up in a family where Hindutva was not considered a good word because of all the narratives that were built. But then I realized what a beautiful word it is, because it is about finding yourself as a people, and we need to keep continuing this. I think the last point that I want to make is about the real caste system in British India. Now, this is something that I sort of devised and have added it to my research paper. I was reading some articles about the railway caste hierarchy, okay? And then I started to research what was the real hierarchy in British India, because it clearly, that article was beautifully written, and it was, by the way, in the Wire, and it said that there was a hierarchy there in the railway system, and it was just a beautiful article. It was not about any politics. It was just telling a story. And from that, I got the cues to research. So let me say, the real caste system of India, based on some research that I've done, it was very clear in the railway hierarchy. Railways were the epitome of casteism as established by the British, the racial system. And of course, the white colonialists were at the highest. They had a plush carriage that would be attached in the railway system, right? They would get the royalest of treatments when they entered, and their carriage would be attached, which would be the most plush carriage that you would ever see, right? The second in line would be the Parsis, which I think most people would not know, but the British considered the Parsis and called them the real Aryans. So they said that, so Parsis were always given all the businesses, the opium trade, as you know, was always handled by the Parsis. They were given tracts and tracts of land in Bombay, in Gujarat. Even now, a lot of the lands are being owned by Parsis. They were given also like club management of the clubs. They were allowed to enter the clubs, which were meant where Indians and dogs were not allowed. Parsis would be allowed. So that is the kind of treatment the Parsis received in British India, and they became obviously very, very rich, and even today they have some of the largest land holdings in India. The third was the biracials, so the biracials or Anglo-Indians. The Anglo-Indians were also, so both Parsis and Anglo-Indians were allowed to travel in second class, what is called the second class. First class is always the whites, right? The second class was the Parsis and the biracials. They were also allowed to have their first class tickets. They would be allowed to even join carriages sometimes if they were very rich, but at higher costs. The fourth was the blue bloods, or the nobles and royals. Nobles and royals, they would obviously have a lot of money, so they were able to afford, and they were allowed, if they were attached to the British kingdom or the British rule, they would be allowed to attach their carriages to the engine, and
like a separate carriage.
A separate carriage.
They
would
were
be
allowed.
allowed. They were allowed. Yes.
Okay.
They were allowed. And then there were the brown sahibs, right? Brown sahibs would be allowed to also have a third class ticket, right? Then they would be allowed to These were the brown sahibs, like maybe in the bureaucracy, but some were also people who were colluders and collaborators, who would be spies for the British. And so they were allowed to be part of the third class, where they were at least cushioned seating, or, they were allowed to have seats there. They were given titles, like Nawab Bahadur or Khan Bahadur, depending on if they are Muslims or Hindu. And Rai Bahadur was also one of the title. Rai Sahib, those kind of titles were given. They were allowed to sit with some payment as kursi nashin. Kursi nashin was a term which meant like, well, all other Indians were sitting on the floor and only the whites were sitting on top on the chairs. Um, they were allowed to pay some money and sit on chairs in the front, So this is the kind of system they had for what would the real caste system. This is the real hierarchy if you think about it. Also, the martial races was sixth in line. So they had defined the martial races as those who helped them, right? So they had added, these are the people who are allowed to be part of the military, like the Sikhs, like the Gurkhas, also a lot of the Muslims, which is why when Islamabad, Lahore, that's Islamabad, Rawalpindi was the one of the big cantonments, right? And Islamabad became a military state after independence because there were so many Muslims in the British army, right, that had power, and they were also part of the martial races as considered by the British. And so a lot of them were on the cavalry, horse riding, the Muslims, and then a lot of the Indian were foot infantry, foot soldiers. So that's the martial races, and they were allowed to have, again, army had its own little compartments, but those were usually wooden seats, just plain. What is today considered the general class, maybe in Indian trains. I mean, pre-Modi trains, I would say. But then the seventh was the cattle class, right? In the Indian trains, the cattle class was basically all other Indians and Hindus specifically who had no seating. They were like cattle used to go in railway, if you've seen ever a cattle compartment, that is how they used to travel, and that is where the term cattle class was invented.
So this was written as it is, cattle class.
Cattle class is a term, if you see Shashi Tharoor talking about it, he talks a lot about these kind of terminology. So yes, cattle class was a term that was invented, and that was a compartment that had no, like, there's a first class, second class. वो cattle class का नाम ही हो जाता था, that is, you're on cattle class, right? So that you've seen it in movies like Gandhi, where people are climbing up, they're everywhere, all over, right? So that is cattle class, and that's how the Indians and Hindus were really treated, like cattle, right? And if you can ride outside a club, Indians and dogs not allowed, that also included the Brahmins. But the last but not the least, the eighth class, which I found, was the criminal tribes and the rebels. Obviously, they were hunted down, killed, they had to live in jungles and, sometimes in very bad, poor conditions. And I bet they were not even, it was not easy for them to travel by train, even cattle class for that matter. But that is how I think the real caste system in British India was created. When the World War II ended, people forgot all about the inquisitions that we talked about. To end and conclude my talk, people forgot the inquisitions. People forgot, and it was taken out of the narrative. All of the blood, the gore, the draconian rules, that was all forgotten. And who became the villain? Only Hitler. Only Nazi Germany.
And they have equal blood, if not more, at least equal blood
on their hands.
Even Churchill, even Stalin, even American soldiers were barbaric to some extent towards the end, because whenever they faced defeat, they would go on plundering. It happened in Japan, near Japan, a lot.
Yes.
So yes, they all had blood on their hands.
They all had blood, and inquisitions particularly were based on the blood purity, blood libel, caste system, as it really is, the system of the castas, And yet, people forget that. They only remember the blood libel of Hitler and his Holocaust. And he became the fall guy, as we call it. In India, they also found a perfect alibi for their crime, and that was the Brahmins. And Brahmins did not even have blood on their hands. You know, they did not even do anything that Hitler did. Brahmins were just scholars. They worked hard and they studied hard, and they, in fact, were the people who taught India its culture and religion. But because they were revered, because they were important to India's culture and social um, upliftment or social organization, they became the fall guys. And the colonialists washed off their sins. The creation of the Dalits, the creation of the Adivasis, creation of the depressed class who became the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, that was created during the British times due to the 6 reasons that I mentioned. And impoverishment of India was the impoverishment of these Dalits and Adivasis. I think I want to put that out very clearly, that these were the people who were, became the victims of British crimes, not of Brahminism or Brahmins. So we have to be very clear that what we have in India is not a caste system, and what really happened to create the Dalits and Adivasis.
So they suffered most, and then the Britishers gave them a new villain, that you're suffering because of them,
Yes, that's
not because of
right.
us.
Exactly. Think about that. And that narrative building, that is why narratives are so important to them. Narratives are so important to them because if we take control of narrative, social media is the biggest pain for them because we are now everywhere.
They're not
right?
able to control the
They are
narrative
not
anymore.
able to control the democratization of knowledge, of information. And that is why this is Sanatan Kisadi, because we are about democracy, we are about equality, we are about social justice. But we have never been given a chance to do our work.
And we are about all that because we are Hindu. We follow this Sanatan practices, and it is
Yes.
naturally in us that
It's, yeah,
we want to follow such practices,
absolutely.
which are democratic, which talks about uplifting everyone, not just one person or some society.
Exactly. So that is instilled in us. We think all religions are same, all people are same, we have that egalitarianism. But that will go only when colonization, neo-colonization that exists today goes. And I think as more and more democracy of technology grows, that'll happen.
Thank you, everyone. Please leave your views and your comments in the comment box so that a discussion can start about this, as we really need to start discussions about this. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Thank you for the session, Richa ji.
Thank you so much for hosting me.